12-year-old Adrian Martinez smiled as he pedaled his bike through his dusty neighborhood in Socorro, Texas, on a hot September day in 2005. School was scheduled to open for the fall the next morning, but Adrian was free as a bird today as he cruised the streets of this small city on the Mexican border. If Adrian was being honest, he was pretty excited to start 8th grade. He was a good student with lots of friends, and he loved playing sports after school. Besides, much as he loved summer vacation, the long, hot days could actually get pretty boring. Adrian was already thinking about what he was going to wear for the first day of school. As Adrian rounded the corner onto a street, he waved to a group of boys playing basketball in their driveway, and he also stopped to pet a neighbor's dog. Adrian had always lived in Socorro, Texas, and he felt like he knew almost everybody there. This truly was his home. Adrian skidded to a stop outside of his family's modest home, where he lived with his mother, whose name was Maricela, and his 3 siblings. Adrian was the oldest boy, and his father was not in the picture, so he and his mother were very, very close. And in a way, Adrian sort of felt like he was the man of the house. Adrian knew that his mother was having a really hard time right now. She didn't have a job, and so supporting him and his siblings was really hard. But at least she didn't have to worry about Adrian. He did his best to make sure of that. Adrian laid his bike down in the front yard and ran to the house, taking the steps to the front door 2 at a time. The next morning, Adrian woke up full of excitement and rushed to the bathroom. He'd woken up early to make sure he could claim the shower before his siblings could come out and create a bathroom traffic jam. But when he was toweling off, Adrian began to notice this weird burning sensation in his right leg. As he looked at his leg more closely, he realized the pain was coming from the pink birthmark that ran from his ankle all the way up to his hip. Adrian had always had this mark, but it had never hurt before, so he just kind of shrugged it off and wrapped the towel around his waist and then wandered out to the kitchen to tell his mother. But when his mother kneeled down and gently pressed her palm against her son's leg, she quickly pulled her hand away and looked up at Adrian with concern. His leg felt weirdly hot, as though only this part of his body was running a fever. Adrian's mother stood up and told her son they would get his leg checked out after school. For now, she just rushed him to his room to go change. He'd be late to class if he didn't hurry. That day, after school, Adrian sat on the edge of a doctor's exam table, swinging his legs back and forth. He felt the cold metal of the stethoscope on his chest as his pediatrician, Dr. Andrews, listened to his heart. Adrian shifted in his seat as Dr. Andrews wrapped an itchy cuff around his upper arm to take his blood pressure. Maricela gave her son a sharp look and reminded him to sit still. Then Dr. Andrews told Adrian to lay back on the table and roll up his right pant leg. The physician gently touched the birthmark, and immediately Adrian squirmed. It didn't exactly hurt when the doctor touched him, but it was uncomfortable. Dr. Andrews would confirm that Adrian's leg was still warm, but besides that, it didn't seem like anything was physically wrong with him. He told Adrian and his mother that this was likely just growing pains, because Adrian was starting to go through puberty. The doctor said it was not uncommon for boys to have these mysterious aches and pains as they grew into men. 4 months later, Adrian was out in the street throwing a football back and forth with his buddy Sam, when as he went to go catch the ball, he suddenly realized he couldn't run very well. His right leg suddenly felt heavy, like it was stuck in mud. Adrian had been playing football with his friends every Saturday since seeing Dr. Andrews, and up until today, everything with his right leg had been totally fine. His birthmark on his leg still did burn a bit, but it wasn't too bad. So Adrian told Sam that he had to go home now because of his leg, but he'd see them next weekend. Then he slowly made the short walk down the street back to his house. And once he got home, he went up to his room and he took off his pants, and when he looked in the mirror, he was totally startled at what he saw. His right leg looked significantly bigger than his left leg. For a second, Adrian was terrified, but then he remembered that his doctor, Dr. Andrews, a few months earlier had said this was no big deal and he had nothing to worry about. And so despite what he was seeing in the mirror, Adrian told himself he was just fine, and then he walked away from the mirror, trying hard to forget what he had just seen. A few weeks later, in February of 2006, Adrian hopped on his bike and began riding to school like he did most mornings. But this time, something just felt wrong. As Adrian pedaled down the street, he felt his right leg bump up against the frame of the bike. He also realized that his jeans on his right leg felt unbelievably tight. Adrian slowed to a stop and looked down at his legs. And immediately he could tell through his jeans that his right leg had ballooned in size overnight. He'd never seen it this swollen. But again, Adrian told himself that his doctor said it was fine, so he pushed the thought away and tried to pedal his bike again. But now it was impossible because of how swollen his leg was. Every time he tried to turn the pedal, his right leg really pushed hard against the frame, and it really hurt. Adrian didn't know what to do, but he knew he couldn't go to school like this. So he stepped off his bike, turned around, and began pushing it along next to him towards his house. And as he walked home, the pain in his right leg was so extreme, he had to fight hard to keep tears back. A couple of weeks later, Adrian sat next to his mother in the doctor's office with his right leg extended out in front of him. It was now so big, it was hard for Adrian to even bend his knee. They were waiting for his latest round of test results. Socorro, Texas was a small city that didn't have that many doctors, but Adrian felt like he'd seen every one of them in the last few weeks. They'd run every test they could think of. Adrian had multiple x-rays, MRIs, and CAT scans done. The doctors hadn't told Adrian or Maricela what exactly they were looking for, but so far, they hadn't found anything. Adrian hoped this new doctor would have some sort of answer for him. All he wanted was for his leg to go back to normal so he could play football again and ride his bike again. Just then, Adrian heard the door handle rattle, and Adrian's latest doctor walked into the room carrying several pieces of paper. The doctor looked down at the papers, then spoke to Adrian and his mother. On the positive side, the doctor said that Adrian did not have heart disease, kidney failure, or a host of other very serious conditions. But the doctor said he had to admit that he didn't know why Adrian's leg was swollen, and so he didn't know how to make it stop. So the doctor ultimately advised Adrian and his mother to just kind of leave the leg alone and let it heal on its own. Adrian couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been watching his leg grow bigger and bigger for almost 6 months, making it nearly impossible for him to do more and more everyday things. Why couldn't the doctors figure out what was wrong? A few months later, Adrian was sitting in class when the bell sounded to signal the end of the period. Students sprang out of their seats, rushing out of the classroom, but Adrian just sat there and waited for the crowd to thin. Then, when they were all gone, he braced his hands on the desk and pushed himself up to stand with a grunt. As soon as he began to walk, he felt a shooting pain in his right ankle, and he nearly fell over into a table. It had been months since Adrian had seen that doctor that said, just wait this out, but clearly his leg was not getting better. It was just getting worse. By the spring of 2006, his right leg was nearly double the size of his left leg. It looked like the leg belonged to a totally different body. Adrian had started wearing these really baggy jeans in an attempt to hide his right leg, but all his classmates knew, and they were not shy about teasing him. As Adrian limped out of the classroom, he felt the students in the hallway shift their gaze to his leg. Some pointed at him and whispered or giggled as Adrian's cheeks burned red, but right now, Adrian's biggest problem was not embarrassment. It was the pain in his ankle. The sheer weight of his right leg was now so enormous, it felt like his foot was going to collapse with every step. Adrian gritted his teeth and kept his head down as he walked past all the students who were laughing at him, and he made his way to the nurse's office. Once he was there, he asked to make a phone call, and when he called his mother, he did his best to keep his voice steady as he told her she needed to come pick him up right now. About an hour later, Maricela stood in the emergency room, anxiously watching as a flurry of doctors and nurses surrounded her son. She stayed by Adrian's side as he was put in a wheelchair and rushed him from one exam room to another. Once again, the doctors took x-rays and CAT scans and MRIs. They measured the diameter of his right leg and compared it to the information Maricela had given them about how much it had grown. They listened intently as Adrian explained all of his symptoms. Maricela thought this actually seemed different from all their other doctors' visits. Like finally now, these doctors were taking Adrian's issues really seriously. Maricela hoped this was the turning point that Adrian had been waiting for, and that the medical team would finally be able to figure out what this was and then help her son. After spending much of the day at the hospital, Maricela brought the car around to the front entrance to pick up her son. A nurse wheeled Adrian outside, and Maricela helped him out of the wheelchair and into the passenger seat. She squeezed Adrian's hand as they pulled out of the driveway. They'd be back here in 3 weeks for the test results. For now, all they could do was hope for the best. After a long 3 weeks, Maricela and Adrian were back at the hospital to go over Adrian's test results. Maricela sat next to her son in the exam room, her hands clammy as they waited for the doctor. Maricela could also feel the anxiety radiating off of Adrian as he quickly flipped through a book, no doubt just trying to distract himself. Finally, the door opened and the doctor strolled in. He sat down in the chair opposite from the mother and son, and he glanced down at his clipboard before turning his gaze to Adrian. In a calm tone, he told Adrian that the good news was that they did have a diagnosis and it was not life-threatening. These last few weeks, Maricela hadn't dared speak the words out loud to Adrian, but secretly, she worried her son had cancer or some other deadly disease. So to hear this was not life-threatening was just such a relief. But Maricela's sense of relief lasted only about a second, because the doctor then told Adrian that he had something called elephantiasis, which is a rare disorder that causes the lower half of the body to thicken and swell. He explained that when someone has elephantiasis, the natural fluids that surround all the tissues in our bodies get blocked and begin to build up. And in Adrian's case, it was affecting his right leg, causing it to swell and become huge. Maricela turned to her son and asked if he was okay, but instead of answering her, he just looked at the doctor and asked if they could fix it. The doctor took his glasses off, set them down on his knee, and with a solemn look on his face, he told Adrian, unfortunately, there was no cure for this. If they'd caught it when Adrian was younger, they could have given him medicine that might have stopped his leg from swelling, but now there was no way to reverse it. Adrian's leg would never go back to its normal size, and the only thing he could do was wear compression stockings to reduce the discomfort. Maricela watched as her son's lip began to quiver, and then tears began to well up in his eyes. She wrapped her arms around her son and began to smooth his hair back. The doctor excused himself to give Maricela and Adrian some privacy. He said he was so sorry he couldn't be more helpful. After the doctor was gone, Adrian looked up at his mother and he told her that he wasn't sure if he could keep going to school with his leg looking like this. He was going to get bullied constantly. Maricela was thinking the same thing, but she told him it would be okay, they'd find a way to make school more comfortable for him. She said she would do whatever she could to support him. Adrian leaned on his mother's shoulder as they slowly made their way out of the hospital towards their car. Then they drove in silence all the way home. Three years later, Adrian slowly limped into class, mouthing the word "sorry" to his teacher, Mr. Perez. Adrian was used to arriving late for pretty much everything by now thanks to his leg, which only continued to grow. Now, as a junior in high school, his leg was nearly triple the diameter of a normal man's thigh, and it weighed about 150 pounds all by itself. Adrian's leg was so big, he couldn't even fit it in a normal wheelchair anymore. Teachers let Adrian leave his class 10 minutes early to give him extra time, but he was still almost always late to his next class. Some teachers got annoyed, but Mr. Perez didn't mind. Adrian hobbled to the back of the class, wincing as he took his seat. He was still a good student, making great grades and participating in class, but that was partly because, by this point, schoolwork was pretty much the only thing Adrian could do. He couldn't play sports, and he didn't hang out with his friends anymore, and he barely left the house except to go to class. And now, Adrian had yet another problem. Seemingly overnight, a swath of itchy pimples had sprung up on his leg. And so he wriggled in his seat, trying to find a more comfortable position, when suddenly he felt something burst on his right leg. Adrian looked down in horror as he saw a wet stain begin to seep through the fabric of his jeans. And then an awful smell wafted up to his nose. One of Adrian's new pimples had burst, and it smelled disgusting like rotten eggs, but even worse. Adrian carefully glanced around the classroom, seeing if anybody else had noticed yet. Mr. Perez stood up in front, writing math equations on the whiteboard. Most of the other kids were copying down notes, but the students right in front of Adrian, so near the back of the classroom, they began swiveling their heads around to face Adrian while wrinkling their noses. As the smell fanned out towards the front of the room, more and more students began to notice. They started looking around, pinching their noses with their fingers, and muttering about not being able to breathe. Adrian stared down at his desk, unbelievably mortified, not daring to make eye contact with anyone. Every time Adrian thought he could not be more humiliated by his leg, there was always a new low, and this was it. It was bad enough that everybody made fun of him because of how big his leg was, but now his legs smelled bad too. Adrian hung his head in shame and began counting the seconds until he'd be able to leave school and go back home. Later that week, Adrian struggled out of his jeans in an exam room at a dermatologist's office. As he did, Adrian scrunched up his nose in disgust because, without his pants sort of masking the smell, the odor from his right leg now overpowered the room. Adrian wrapped a disposable gown around his waist and then sat down in the exam chair. After a few minutes, Adrian heard a knock at the door, and the doctor entered the room. He gave Adrian a big smile, and he asked what brought him in today. Adrian tried to match the doctor's upbeat energy, but he couldn't bring himself to smile. Instead, he started talking about the itchy pimples on his leg. After Adrian finished explaining, the doctor said, "Okay, let me see your leg." And so Adrian slowly reached down and pulled aside his gown, revealing his swollen, pimple-covered leg. And it was obvious the doctor was really caught off guard by what he was seeing. But after the initial shock wore off, the doctor kind of composed himself and then told Adrian and Maricela that he'd never seen such a big leg before. Adrian immediately looked over at his mother and stifled a groan. He was looking for help from this doctor, not to be treated like some science experiment or circus act. Finally, the doctor slipped on some latex gloves and leaned in for a closer look. And after a few minutes of poking and prodding, the doctor explained that these were not pimples on Adrian's legs, but instead they were pus-filled blisters. And unfortunately, he didn't know what was causing them. Then he reminded Adrian to make sure he was taking regular showers to keep his leg clean. Adrian suddenly wished the reclining chair he was on would just swallow him whole, so he didn't have to sit here while the dermatologist lectured him about taking showers. Usually, the doctor's office was the only place Adrian did not feel self-conscious about his leg. But thanks to this dermatologist, even that was no longer true. A few days later, Adrian was back at school, sitting in Mr. Perez's class. Mr. Perez could see that Adrian looked absolutely miserable. He knew Adrian's leg must be impacting his quality of life, but the teacher didn't know much about Adrian's situation beyond what he observed in class. The teacher wasn't one to get involved in his students' personal lives, but something in Mr. Perez told him this was an unusual situation where maybe he could make a difference. So instead of letting Adrian leave his class early like usual, Mr. Perez actually asked him to stick around after the bell rang. And then once the bell rang and the other students had left the room, Mr. Perez made his way to the back of the class, where Adrian was sitting nervously waiting for him. Mr. Perez quickly reassured Adrian that he was not in trouble. He explained that he noticed Adrian looked really upset and wanted to make sure he was okay. For a few moments, Adrian sat in silence, looking down at the desk, and when he looked up, Mr. Perez could see his eyes were full of emotion. Before long, Adrian told Mr. Perez the whole terrible story of how his leg had grown more and more deformed for years, and no doctor seemed able to do anything to help. It was like Adrian had been waiting for someone to ask him what was wrong, and now the floodgates were open. Later that week, Mr. Perez sat next to Adrian in the school library, scouring the internet for information on elephantiasis. Adrian had explained his diagnosis and how there was no cure, but Mr. Perez figured there had to be something they could do. The pair had been meeting in the library during their lunch periods to use the school computers to see if maybe the doctors had missed something. As Mr. Perez read through another medical article, Adrian, who was right next to him, began laughing at a video of a dog riding a skateboard. Ever since they'd started coming to the library, Adrian had seemed happier. Mr. Perez suspected that Adrian hadn't had a friend for a long time. Mr. Perez turned back to his computer, where he had a tab open to elephantiasis symptoms. He read through the list in a hushed voice, verifying each one with Adrian, and as Mr. Perez read on, they realized something strange. Adrian had some of the symptoms of elephantiasis, but other symptoms, such as persistent coughing and chills, were way off. And so a strange thought crossed Mr. Perez's mind. Maybe Adrian did not have elephantiasis. Maybe he had something else entirely. Later that night, Mr. Perez was home working at his desktop computer. He couldn't stop thinking about the discovery he and Adrian had made at lunch. So he created a new document in Microsoft Word and started typing out all the other types of diseases that could cause a person's leg to swell up as much as Adrian's had. One by one, he compared the list of symptoms for each disease to the symptoms Adrian experienced. And when they didn't match up, Mr. Perez would cross the potential diagnosis off his list and keep on going. After several hours, Mr. Perez was bleary-eyed but determined, and his list was shrinking. He took a sip of coffee, and then he clicked on a disease that he had never heard of before. As he read through the symptoms, his heart began to race. He couldn't believe it. This condition sounded like a perfect fit to what was going on with Adrian. Now he just needed to find an expert that could help. The reality was, Socorro, Texas was a small community without many medical resources. So Mr. Perez knew they would not be able to get Adrian the specialized care he needed here. So Mr. Perez searched the web for experts in this disease he had identified all over the country. And after digging through hospital directories and online forums, he came across a doctor in New York who might be able to help. 2 weeks later, Dr. Robert Rosen sat down in his oversized desk chair after a long day of surgeries and patient consultations in his busy New York office. He surveyed the stacks of letters and paperwork that littered his desk, and he sighed. He doubted he'd make it home in time for dinner. He leaned forward and began rifling through the documents when he noticed a large manila envelope peeking out from under a cluster of papers. Dr. Rosen pulled out the parcel, surprised by how heavy it was. The return address was in Texas. Curious, the doctor ripped open the seal and spread the contents out in front of him. His eyes grew wide as he took in the slew of medical records and test results. Then he saw the photograph of Adrian Martinez and nearly fell out of his chair. In his 30 years as an endovascular surgeon, Dr. Rosen had only seen a handful of cases like this one, and none were this severe. The photo showed Adrian sitting on a couch with his right leg extended. The boy's leg took up practically the entire sofa. It was full of folds and crevices and absolutely massive. There was a letter from Adrian's mother explaining that her son desperately needed help. The doctors in Texas had diagnosed Adrian with elephantiasis, but it just didn't seem right. Her son wasn't getting any better, and now she worried for his life. Dr. Rosen looked back over the medical records, and sure enough, he saw that Adrian had been diagnosed with elephantiasis. But just as Adrian's mother and Mr. Perez had suspected, that diagnosis was definitely wrong. Dr. Rosen grabbed the photograph again and studied the pink mark that now covered the bulk of Adrian's right leg. That was it, the doctor thought to himself. That birthmark was the key. A few days later, Adrian huddled with his mother at the kitchen table, anxiously waiting for their phone to ring. They were expecting a call from Dr. Rosen any minute to discuss what was really wrong with Adrian's leg. When the phone finally rang, Maricela jumped to answer it, putting the phone on speaker and placing the phone on the table in front of her and Adrian. Dr. Rosen introduced himself, and Adrian immediately began to relax. He'd been waiting for this moment for years. Whatever happened next, at least Adrian would get some answers. Dr. Rosen started by telling Adrian that he did not have elephantiasis. He never did. Instead, Adrian had a very rare condition called Klippel-Trenaunay syndrome, or KTS. The same disease Mr. Perez had suspected from his internet research. He explained that KTS is something you're born with, and what it does is it causes the blood vessels in someone's arm or leg to warp and twist, which makes it hard for blood and other fluids to be distributed properly throughout that limb. In Adrian's case, the blood and fluid had pooled in his right leg, causing intense swelling. And it started happening when he hit puberty because sometimes hormonal changes act as the trigger for KTS. Dr. Rosen said that KTS can be hard to diagnose because it is so uncommon, affecting just 1 out of every 100,000 people. But there's usually a telltale sign that's visible from birth, a pinkish-purple birthmark on one leg, just like the one Adrian had. With time, the birthmark can thicken and develop painful blisters, another one of Adrian's symptoms, and those blisters were actually Dr. Rosen's main concern, because those blisters were full of infected bodily fluids, which is why the pus that poured out of them smelled so bad. Dr. Rosen paused for a moment before continuing. He said that the infection can spread very quickly throughout the body, and in some cases it can cause high blood pressure or even a stroke and organ damage. Dr. Rosen warned that Adrian's condition was actually so serious that there was a chance the KTS could actually kill him, and unfortunately, there was no cure. Adrian's heart raced as Dr. Rosen told him that he now had an almost impossible decision that he would have to make. He said that Adrian could continue to just live with his KTS, risking his life daily, or he could undergo a surgery that he would only have a 50% chance of surviving. In October of 2009, Adrian was wheeled into surgery. Adrian had weighed the pros and cons out, and as terrifying as it was, he knew his only chance at a happy, normal life was to risk the operation, which was a very complicated leg amputation. The procedure took 12 hours, but Adrian did survive, and the surgery was a success. Once Adrian recovered, he returned to school in a wheelchair. He was 150 pounds lighter, and it felt like he was floating through the halls. He finished out his junior year with straight A's and spent the summer adjusting to his new life. And without his leg holding him back, Adrian blossomed in other ways too. He grew more confident, and he rebuilt the social life that he'd lost. And Adrian was so grateful to the adults who didn't give up on him. And he and Mr. Perez stayed really good friends. He went on to attend the University of Texas at El Paso, and in 2019, he graduated with 2 degrees in computer science and business. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning, and so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point, but he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly, Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground. And then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There was still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate. And he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't. And then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell, just from the panicked look on Mike's face, that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused. And he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer, and they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out, and for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son, and so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. Then, when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. Our next story is called Fans. In 2009, 25-year-old Larry Mario Moncada graduated from college and moved back in with his parents in Iowa. He was excited about his future, and his parents were extremely proud of him. As soon as Larry moved back home, the first thing he did was go out and get a placeholder job at the No Frills supermarket, which was a local supermarket right in town. He figured, you know what, it's temporary, but I don't want to just sit around all day. I want to do that until I find my career. But even though the job was supposed to be temporary, he found that he kind of loved the job because he loved the people he worked with, and his coworkers would later say that they loved working with him too. But everything in Larry and his family's life would get turned completely upside down in November of 2009. On November 26th, while a blizzard raged outside, Larry and his family celebrated Thanksgiving inside. After everyone was done eating, Larry told them that he actually had an overnight shift at the supermarket. And I don't think his family knew he had this shift, so they were like, oh man, do you really gotta go? The weather's so bad. And he's like, no, I gotta go, I don't mind. And they're like, all right, well, hey, sorry you gotta work. And Larry walks outside and goes to work. The next morning when he came back from that shift, his mother would say something seemed off about him. When he came inside, he was very disoriented, he didn't really know where he was, and his mom's trying to tell him that everything's okay, what's going on, did something happen out there? And this is when it dawned on her that he could be having an anxiety attack. Just a few years earlier, Larry had had a whole bunch of panic attacks and he was really struggling with anxiety, and it wasn't until his mom made him go to the doctor and put him on medication that he stabilized. But at this moment, she didn't know if her son was on any medication or not, so just to play it safe, she said, hey, let's go to the doctor and have you looked at. You don't seem well. So she brings him to the doctor, and the doctor quickly prescribes Larry an antidepressant. They go and fill the prescription, they go back home, and Larry takes one of these antidepressants. But the medication didn't seem to be doing anything because over the course of the day, Larry got progressively more and more stressed out and more confused seeming, and eventually he told his mom that he was hearing voices in his head that were telling him his heart is beating too quickly and he needs to eat sugar to slow down his heart. And his mom is looking at him thinking, what do I do about this? And so all she could think to do was just to stand next to him and kind of comfort him as he sits there eating sugar over the course of the day. Finally that night, he would fall asleep, and his mother prayed that over the course of the night that somehow this medication he had been prescribed would kick in and he would wake up and feel better, because so far, it really seemed to only be getting exponentially worse. But the next morning when Larry got up, he was just as bad as the night before, except now he was having these vivid hallucinations. He said there were people in the house that were looking for him, and so he spent the day running around the house, hiding from people in the house that were not actually there. Then finally that night, Larry just kind of loses it and begins screaming at his parents and berating them before suddenly running out the front door without shoes, without a jacket, no wallet, no cell phone, no anything. And he just runs directly into the blizzard and disappears. His family was so caught off guard by this happening that it took them a minute to get out the front door after him, but it was snowing so hard they could barely see in front of their face, and they knew he was gone. So immediately they call the police, but the police have the same issue. They can't really go looking for him right now because the visibility was so bad. And so they told his family that we can't really start until tomorrow morning, so hopefully he turns up tonight. So the next day, when the weather clears up a little bit, the police go out looking for Larry, and they're asking people in town if they've seen him, and no one's seen Larry. And unfortunately, because it had snowed so much the night before, any of Larry's tracks leading out of Larry's house were now covered over. And so after a couple of days of this, when there's just no sign of this guy, the police say to the family, look, there's not much we can do. We're just going to have to wait to see if he turns up. 10 years later, the No Frills supermarket where Larry used to work was out of business and it was about to get torn down, and some contractors were sent in to start ripping down the shelving and breaking down the inside of the building. And when they went into the back and began pulling away those huge freezers that keep your milk and your dairy products in, they start pulling those away from the wall. Larry's body comes tumbling out. It had been pinned in this tiny 18-inch wide space between the back of the freezer and the wall. It's believed on the night Larry ran out of his parents' house barefoot into a blizzard, he ran right up the road and went to the No Frills supermarket. Now, it was closed at the time, but he had access to the back door with the key code because he worked there. And so he went inside and he climbed on top of the freezers, the section of the freezers that jut back into the space that no one in the store can see. And he climbed on top because on top of there, all the workers would kind of congregate up there. It was like a little clubhouse where the workers would avoid the managers for little pockets of the day. And so Larry probably climbed up there because it represented a really happy place for him. And when he got up there, he must have somehow tripped and fallen into the tiny 18-inch space between the freezer and the wall. Investigators believe there's no way he actually got hurt when he fell into this little space. He got wedged in there, but he wasn't harmed. The problem was these huge fans that run constantly to keep the freezer cold were unbelievably loud and would have completely drowned out his cries for help. And so no one knows for sure how long this took, but eventually he would die because no one heard him. Looking back at old Facebook posts around the time that Larry would have been dead behind the freezer, there was a whole bunch of people that were commenting on Facebook that they didn't want to shop at the No Frills supermarket anymore. Apparently there was a really bad smell coming out of the back freezer. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Blue Door. On the morning of September 19th, 2013, a man named Mark Casey sat with his girlfriend, Lynn Spalding, in the triage area of the emergency room at San Francisco General Hospital. A nurse took Lynn's temperature and her blood pressure, while Mark tried to explain what had been going on with Lynn over the past few weeks. Lynn, who was now 57, had been dealing with this really intense stomach pain, and so she had gone to the doctor, and she had been diagnosed with a urinary tract infection, and she was given antibiotics for it, but despite taking those antibiotics, it didn't get rid of the stomach pain. And in fact, her stomach pain was only getting worse, she was losing weight, and she just seemed really frail. But despite her condition obviously getting worse every single day, over the past few weeks, Lynn had basically refused to go back to the hospital, despite Mark saying, "We really gotta go, you're getting worse, we gotta have you looked at." But she just kept saying no. And then finally, when Mark noticed Lynn was now becoming somewhat despondent, like he would try to talk to her and her eyes would glaze over and she would look off into the distance like she didn't even hear him, Mark had just looked at Lynn and said, "You know what? I'm taking you to the hospital." And so he put her in the car, he brought her to the hospital, and now that he was here, he had to explain what was going on because Lynn was still despondent, just kind of staring off into space and very likely having no idea what was going on. And so after Mark gave all the information to the nurse said that, okay, Lynn needs to be admitted to the hospital. And so after a short wait, an orderly came over and pushed Lynn's wheelchair up to the 5th floor where she'd be staying, and Mark went with them. And then once in the room, Mark helped Lynn get settled in her bed. And again, Lynn is just kind of staring off into space, not really paying attention. And then a whole team of nurses and doctors came in and hooked Lynn up to IVs and different machines to make sure they could monitor her. And then at some point, one of the doctors pulled Mark aside and said, we think Lynn is dealing with some kind of infection. And so what we need to do is run some tests to figure out what this infection is. And then hopefully we can treat it. And so Mark said, okay, that sounds great. And then all day, Mark sat right next to Lynn and held her hand as the medical team came in and out of the room running all these tests. The following day, the medical team still didn't know what was wrong with Lynn. The tests they had run so far were inconclusive or were negative. Now, the biggest issue with Lynn was not trying to figure out what infection she had or how to cure her. Instead, it was, how do we keep Lynn in her hospital room? Because on this second day that Lynn was at the hospital, despite being very despondent still, any chance she got, she was getting out of her bed and trying to escape her room. And so the medical team, they kept having to go find her and bring her back to her room. And they tried to explain to her, like, Lynn, you're sick. That's why you're here. You need to stay in your room. But Lynn clearly was just not getting it. She was just not there. And she would just say to the team, I want to go home. I just want to go home. I want to go home. And they would say, well, Lynn, you got to get better first, and then you can go home. Now, Mark, like the medical staff, was also concerned about Lynn's behavior. It was not safe for her to get up and flee her hospital room. But Mark kind of secretly thought, maybe this is a good sign, because the day before, Lynn couldn't even walk on her own. And now today, she's walking around on her own trying to escape the hospital, which is bad. But, she's ambulatory. That's got to be a good sign. And also, Mark was thinking that because Lynn was fleeing her room over and over again, she's going to get even better medical care because the staff has to be super focused on her. And so Mark was feeling kind of optimistic that Lynn was on the road to recovery. The next morning, so now Lynn has been at the hospital for 2 days at this point, a nurse went into Lynn's room to check on her at about 10:15 a.m., and she walked up to Lynn, who was in her bed, and Lynn immediately told the nurse that she wanted to go home, and the nurse said, sorry, Lynn, we still don't know what's wrong with you. You got to stay here for now. But again, it was pretty clear Lynn did not understand what the nurse was saying. And so Lynn was not agitated. She was laying in bed and did not appear to, want to flee the room anytime soon. And so the nurse took Lynn's vitals. They were all basically normal. And then the nurse wrote down on Lynn's chart that her condition as of this moment was fair. And then the nurse left the room. And once this nurse was gone, Lynn laid in bed for a second, and then when nobody else came in the room, she sat up, she hopped off the bed, and she took off her hospital gown. She pulled out all the cords and wires that were on her. Then she put on her jeans, her boots, her jacket. She grabbed her purse off the table, and she walked out the door. And the second she walked out the door, she would have been in this long hallway, except her room was at the end of the hallway. So when she stepped out into that hallway, if she turned right, she would have seen a long, long stretch of hallway with other hospital rooms and lots of staff and doctors and nurses kind of walking around. But to her left, it would have been a dead end with a single blue door with a green exit sign over the top of it. And so Lynn, she steps into the hallway, she looks down the long side to the right, then she looks to the left, she sees the blue door, and she goes to the blue door, she opens it up, and she disappears inside. When the nurse came back to Lynn's room and saw she wasn't there, she reported Lynn missing. Now, remember, the hospital was well aware of the fact that Lynn had been trying to escape for the past 48 hours, and so nobody was really shocked by this. In fact, the hospital, their first move was to contact Mark, who had actually gone home the night before to get some real sleep and to take a shower. And so they contacted Mark and they said, hey, Lynn's not here. Is she with you? And Mark was like, no, I'm home. She's not here. I have not seen her. I haven't talked to her. I have no idea where she is. And so the hospital at this point began this huge search in their building, just checking the entire property for Lynn, but there was no trace of her. And so the police were contacted and they launched a search both of the hospital grounds and also of the surrounding areas, and they too could not find a trace of Lynn. It was like Lynn just vanished into thin air. That is, until October 8th, 2013, so 17 days after Lynn had strolled through that blue exit door. On that day, October 8th, a hospital maintenance worker was walking down the long hallway in the hospital, not on the 5th floor where Lynn was staying, but one floor below, so on the 4th floor. And he's walking down this long hallway in the direction of the dead end side, so the same side that Lynn was on where her room was, but again, one floor above. And the maintenance worker, he walks all the way to the end of this hallway on the 4th floor, and he arrives in front of the blue door with the green exit sign above it. Again, this is below where Lynn was, but it looks the same. And the maintenance worker, he opened up the door, and when he looked out of the 4th floor door, he just froze, because what he was looking at just seemed impossible. And then he had this urge to scream, but he knew there were all these patients and kids and doctors and stuff in the hallway behind him, and he didn't want to scare anyone. And so very quietly, he reached down and grabbed his radio, and he called for help.
We believe in dreams, hearts full of light. Together we gleam, stars in the night. Bright tomorrow comes after the rain. We rise above pain, shine through the chain.
In order to explain what happened next, you have to have a basic understanding of the layout of this building, specifically the outside of it. If you were outside looking at this building, you would see an enclosed staircase that runs from the bottom to the top of the building, with outdoor landings on each floor. The one on top is the 5th floor landing, and the one below it, with a single person on it, is the 4th floor landing. And to get onto these outdoor landings, you have to walk through those blue exit doors at the end of those hallways. These blue doors are emergency exits. And so when you go out these blue doors, once they shut, they lock automatically. But now you're out on this outdoor landing, and immediately to your right, although you can't see it in this picture, there is actually another door that leads to this enclosed stairwell that will bring you all the way to the ground floor, where there's another door that's unlocked that will bring you out to safety. And so again, you walk out one of those blue doors, you're on this landing, you can turn, open up another door, you're in the stairwell, and you can evacuate. So, in theory, if you were a person that really wanted to escape this hospital, like Lynn did, going out one of these blue door emergency exits was a great idea. It would bring you to the ground. This is a way to escape the hospital. But remember, Lynn was totally confused. Mentally, she was just not there because of whatever illness was affecting her. And so when she walked out that door, she arrived on the 5th floor landing, and the door shut behind her and it locked. And the theory is, as soon as Lynn got out there, maybe she had some second thoughts and wanted to go back into the hospital. And so she turned and she grabbed that door and tried to open it back up again, but because it locks automatically, it wouldn't open. And so Lynn did have the wherewithal to turn and see this other door that led to this enclosed stairwell, the emergency stairwell that did go to the ground floor. She could absolutely go all the way down and escape. She could do that. She went down one floor to the 4th floor landing. And when she got there, she left the stairwell and she went to that door that would lead back into the hospital on the 4th floor, and she tried it, but of course it was locked. And then again, instead of her just going back into the stairwell and going down and escaping to safety, she, for some reason, just stayed on the 4th floor landing. Again, you gotta remember that she's not all there mentally, and so she was confused, and she just stayed there on the landing, basically waiting to be rescued. But despite these huge searches of the hospital property by hospital staff and by the police, for some reason, this area, this landing on the 4th floor, was never checked. And so nobody found her. That is until October 4th. So at this point, Lynn has been outside for 13 days on this landing, And a researcher from the hospital, for whatever reason, exited out one of these emergency doors, and they began making their way downstairs. And when they passed by the 4th floor landing, they spotted Lynn on the ground on the 4th floor landing. But instead of going over to her and seeing if she was okay, this researcher just called security and said, "Hey, there's a patient outside on the 4th floor landing, come check it out." And then instead of waiting for security, the researcher just left, leaving Lynn alone. And security at the hospital, who said they were going to go check, they didn't. And so 4 more days would go by with still nobody officially finding Lynn. And then finally, on October 8th, the hospital maintenance worker opened up the blue door on the 4th floor, and he saw the 4th floor landing, that exterior landing, and he saw Lynn, and he knew she was dead. Officials were never able to determine when Lynn died, so it's not clear how long she was alive out on that landing. But it is possible she could have been alive when that researcher found her, but obviously help didn't come in time. Ultimately, Lynn's family would sue the city and the hospital, and they would be awarded $3 million. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you